So the latest crime statistics are out for the third quarter. So it was looking at the months of October to December 2022, and it was the first time during the festive season that there were no COVID-19 restrictions, which meant that people could move about freely. A grim picture that has been painted by the South African Police Services, with the Police Minister Bheki Cele saying that the police are doing something, they could do more, but they do need the help of the communities, of the everyday citizens, saying we need to take our power back as well. Let's weigh in on the numbers as well as some of the socio-economic factors that the police minister touched on. We're joined by criminologist Guy Lamb. Guy, we need to stop meeting like this, but alas, it is what it is. Let's take a look at what the police minister was saying when it comes to residents of Mfuleni, Alexandra, Inanda, Seshego, Mitchell's Plain, Deep Sloot and Umlazi, saying that these are policing areas with stubborn crime patterns. He also touched on socio-economic issues such as poverty, such as the spatial makeup of those communities. He also touched on the high unemployment rate, lack of service delivery, suggesting that this is not just as simple as saying, well, the police are not doing enough.
Absolutely. I mean, these kind of areas that were pointed to have been high crime areas for decades. I mean, they were before 1994, and we're now in a situation where they've continued to experience elevated high crimes. Of course, they are sitting in situations of poverty. Does make contributions to this issue, but I mean there are many risk factors that contribute to violence in these areas, and service delivery is one of them. Kind of lack of employment is another issue. But we have, there are many countries that are poor with very high levels of unemployment that don't have the levels of crime that we have. So it is these kind of combinations of issues. I mean, there's he's pointed to in the presentation this ongoing issue of access to illegal firearms as the kind of key weapon used to perpetrate murder and attempted murder. He didn't go on so much about alcohol this time, but alcohol is a key facilitatory factor of violence. And if we look at it, what's sort of driving this crime, a lot of it has to do with arguments or disagreements. So the sense of around you have a fight with friends, fight with family members, acquaintances, it escalates and someone gets hurt or killed. But very interestingly in the presentation that was made by they did a sample of, what are the causative factors of murder, for example, and attempted murder. And a big one that was standing out was mob justice and vigilantism, because that's always been on the list, but it's never been as high. It was sort of the second highest cause. And for me, that would really sort of talk to the sense of these high crime communities getting incredibly frustrated with levels of violence in their communities and then trying to do something themselves because the level of policing that they are getting is not acceptable.
And that's just it. In spite of the deployment of that project 10,000, there's also another 10,000 for the 2023 year. The police minister was also talking, as a result of COVID-19, the backlog in receiving the number of cars that are needed to be deployed on the ground. So not only do you have a personnel issue or the number of police officers that are charged to overlook a number of people, which is more people than police officers. Now you also have vehicles that are a problem because there is not enough.
Absolutely. You need vehicles to do visible policing. Visible policing does make a big difference, especially in high crime areas. The police are around criminals, they assess the risk and will say, well, if there are lots of police around, there's a greater chance I will get arrested or be seen. So that police visibility also kind of creates a sense of places are being watched, places are being patrolled. But if police don't have vehicles, especially in high crime areas where they're at risk of being attacked and robbed themselves, is they need vehicles to do their jobs. And there have been key problems and challenges with vehicles not being maintained, vehicles broken down, these high crime police stations not having enough to do the patrolling. So, it's important that they get vehicles, but we've had delays. And also it's the same with the recruitment. Additional 10,000 is helpful, but the one thing that hasn't been discussed, how are they being used? Are they being used to fill the gaps in key areas, or are they just sort of being randomly dispersed throughout the police service?
Again, it's not just a policing issue, because the police minister was pointing that discussions are underway within the security cluster to tighten the gaps and loopholes in the criminal justice system, going as far as speaking of the arrest of a judge. There are a number of police officers who've also been arrested as a result of taking part in nefarious activity, 46 of them.
Yeah, I mean, these are quite important because, you have the side of where crimes happen, and then we have a criminal justice system which is based on the assumption that, society will, kind of behave itself because there is the threat of, going to jail. But in a situation where that threat is, or that risk is quite low, then you kind of tend to see a lot more criminality happening in certain areas. But of course, if, the police aren't doing investigations properly and there's not enough evidence to go to court, or dockets go missing, or there are corrupt people involved in the kind of criminal justice system, then we are going to see, even further loss of faith in the criminal justice system by the members of the public. So it's important to tackle those issues and try and strengthen the system.
He also spoke about gender-based violence. Let's maybe start with the issue of rape. So over 12,000 rapes, over 5,000 of those happening between people that actually know each other. And if you break it further down, that would mean over 130 rapes a day taking place in just 3 months, suggesting what about South Africa?
I mean, South Africa we've always had a problem with violence against women, violence against girls. Sexual violence, the crime stats unfortunately don't give us an accurate and complete picture of it, because these types of crimes and this type of violence is often highly underreported, especially by younger women, especially by minors who are kind of experiencing that sort of abuse within the family home. But I mean, it really does talk to, we have plans to deal with it. We have this strategic plan to deal with gender-based violence and femicide. There was a presidential summit about it a few months ago, and there were activists there were raising concerns about we haven't seemed to be able to make a dent in this, and it really underscores that we have these plans, but we really need to be investing in implementing them so we can try and bring down these kind of horrible incidences from happening.
Is there a little bit of hope? I mean, there was a report also from the police minister that they've cleared the historic DNA backlog by 99.3%. So as of yesterday, that backlog, which was 241,000, is now 1,600.
Yeah, I mean, if we take the minister's word at it, that really is an accomplishment, and the SAPs need to be congratulated for that, because that was, something that was hampering the criminal justice system. Victims were not getting justice. Cases were getting thrown out of court, or convictions were not being secured. So, I mean, I think that's really important, but it's essential that we don't take our foot off the accelerator. We really need to make sure that we can get DNA analysis done fairly quickly to ensure that perpetrators who perpetrate violence against one individual are apprehended so they don't continue the abuse.
Operation Ukai Molau to be rolled out nationally?
Well, I mean, these kind of national operations, I think, are quite important. I mean, they really are. You kind of got to have a centralized approach to it, because crime does affect all regions. So I think it is really important to kind of have a focus on a sort of an operation that brings different parts of the police together to focus on a specific issue.
Guy, we touched on it in the beginning of the conversation that it would seem that we are partially, throwing the police at an issue that is much bigger than them. So socio-economic issues and social ills that are playing themselves out in the form of this violence, with the police minister saying we need to be honest with ourselves and ask ourselves why we are such a violent society. And then he goes on to speak to issues of a lack of service delivery, poverty, high unemployment rate, etc. And so when you take a look at our prison system in the country, can we afford to go on the trajectory that we are on?
No, we can't. I mean, the kind of situation, if we want to take an approach in South Africa, we want to have significant reductions in violent crime. A kind of a nail them and jail them approach can have an impact in the short term, but it doesn't solve the problem. I mean, what the minister was speaking about is, kind of societal economic drivers of this violence. Of course, we really need to break that down further. We have a problem of violent men, predominantly young violent men within South Africa. Many of them are poor, many of them are unemployed. But I mean, that kind of poverty and that unemployment are not the kind of key determining factors of the violence and the crime. A lot of it has to do with these are young men who've experienced trauma in their pasts, and that trauma manifests into kind of violent behavior, have access to firearms, access to alcohol, kind of the socializations that happen where violence is promoted, the norms and behaviors are kind of encouraged in certain group settings. So it is, a lot more than just the unemployment and the poverty and kind of the policing angle. And South Africa has something called the Integrated Crime and Violence Prevention Strategy, which government approved last year, which kind of talks to, how do we address all these multidimensional drivers of violent crime in South Africa. And it hasn't really been implemented. It hasn't really got its legs yet because it means that different government departments have to work well together. And that's just the one thing that the South African government, but many other governments just can't get right, because it's about sharing of resources. It's about, kind of being various government departments having to work together, not working in silos. So it is something we've really been struggling with in South Africa. But that is, the long-term foreseeable approach if we actually want to get a handle on this violent crime. We've got to stop it. You've got to have interventions now to see results in the future.
And then add to all of that, right, you search for the light at the end of the tunnel, but sure, he spoke of a direct link of load shedding on the increase in crime. He also spoke of an operation where 17 people have been arrested for this coal sabotage of Eskom, including some farmers. I guess it's also, more information that is coming out where we're getting some concrete information from the police on this operation of people who are sabotaging Eskom, as we have been hearing. And so what hope is there, right? Because it would seem that the police are in the dark as we are.
Well, I mean, it depends on different crimes. I mean, I think, we had the crime stats released today, and we also had yesterday a really important court judgment against hitmen in the Mlazi area who've been operating out of Lebanon's hostel. So a long trial, but we got convictions there, which is really important in light of the AKA murder and assassination of a few days ago. I mean, the sense of around, we've seen improvements within the National Prosecuting Authority. We've seen, an independent investigative directorate within that particular structure. Increased focus on corruption, because, I mean, the one thing that's quite clear is that we have a problem with organized crime. So it's not just, it's gangs and drugs, but it's organized crime that's looking at mining in the extractive sector, and we've seen that with coal. The fact is now we've identified the problems. We have government that's taking them seriously and prioritizing it. So I think that is a bit of a light at the end of the tunnel around that there now seems to be a lot more political will on this issue, where the police can have an impact. On some of the more violent interpersonal crimes, they can't have such a big impact. But on this, if they get their intelligence right, if they gather sufficient evidence and it's kind of evidence can be taken to court, then you can start shutting these syndicates down. Other light at the end of the tunnel, the minister was talking about, more resources to community police forums through legislation. They've been crying out for that for quite a while, so that's quite an important element, especially if the police want better community buy-in. That's going to help. So I think there's kind of some positive developments out of this. But we do have, sitting in load shedding, the stats also show that increase in home robberies, increase in burglaries, increase in kind of street robberies or common robberies, and that is largely due to COVID, load shedding at night, street lights out, people being targeted in those kind of scenarios.
Guy Lamb is a criminologist. Thank you very much for your time this afternoon.